The coffee in the French press was still hot, steam rising against the backdrop of a gray Chicago skyline. But the other side of the king-size bed was perfectly cold, untouched since yesterday. It wasn't the first time she had stayed out late for a gallery opening, but it was the first time her phone had gone straight to voicemail, until a single notification blinked on his screen, time-stamped at 3:14 a.m. It wasn't a message she meant to send, but rather a recording of what happened when she thought the call had ended, revealing a whisper that shattered 10 years of trust in 10 seconds. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet, devastating moments where a marriage unravels, not with a scream, but with a whisper, stay here, because we are just beginning to listen to the truth. The silence in the apartment was heavy, the kind that pressed against the ears. Mark Evans stood in the center of the kitchen, the stainless steel appliances gleaming under the cold morning light that poured in from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago lay below them, a grid of gray concrete and white snow, waking up slowly to a Sunday in February. Mark held his ceramic mug with both hands, letting the heat seep into his palms. But he didn't drink. He looked at the clock on the microwave. 8:14 a.m. She was never this late. Even after the wildest gallery openings, even after the post-show dinners that dragged on until 2 in the morning, Elena always made it home. She might stumble in smelling of expensive white wine and faint cigarette smoke, a habit she only indulged in when she was nervous. But she came home. She would slip into the bed beside him, her feet cold against his calves, grounding him. Today, the space beside him was pristine. The duvet was unwrinkled. The pillow was fluffed, exactly how the housekeeper had left it yesterday. Mark set the mug down on the marble island. A small ring of condensation formed at the base. He picked up his phone for the 10th time in the last hour. No texts, no missed calls. He opened their message thread. His last text to her was from 11:30 p.m. last night. "Don't stay out too late. I made sure the coffee is stocked for the morning." No read receipt. A subtle tightening began in his chest, a physical manifestation of the logic centers in his brain shutting down, replaced by the primal alarm of a husband. Car accident? Mugging? Did she leave her phone in a cab? He unlocked the screen again, his thumb hovering over the call icon. He didn't want to be the controlling husband. He didn't want to be the man who checked up on his capable 34-year-old wife every hour. They prided themselves on their independence, their modern arrangement of trust. But the sun was fully up now, reflecting blindingly off Lake Michigan, and the apartment felt like a tomb. He tapped the phone icon. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, it went to voicemail. "Hi, this is Elena. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave a..." He hung up before the beep. He paced the length of the living room, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of his footsteps. He told himself to wait until 9 a.m. If she wasn't back by 9, he would call her assistant, Sarah. He sat on the edge of the beige sofa, staring at the black screen of his iPhone. Suddenly, the screen lit up. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He snatched the phone up. It wasn't a call. It was a notification. New voicemail from Elena. Mark frowned. The phone hadn't rung. He must have had poor reception in the elevator earlier when he went down to get the paper, and the notification was just pushing through now. He stared at the details. From Elena. Mobile. Time, 3:14 a.m. Duration, 2:43. 3 in the morning. Relief washed over him first. She had called. She was probably telling him she was staying at Sarah's, or that she had lost track of time and didn't want to wake him. It was a long message, nearly 3 minutes. Maybe she was rambling, drunk and happy, recounting the sale of a major piece. He pressed the speakerphone button and turned the volume up, leaning back against the cushions. "Check the light?" Mark froze. The voice was Alina's, but it wasn't directed at the phone. It was distant, slightly muffled, as if the phone had been slipped between cushions or was lying face down on a nightstand. There was a rustling sound, fabric against fabric, the friction of sheets. "Leave it off," a man's voice replied. It was deep, smooth, and terrifyingly close to the microphone. Mark stopped breathing. The air in the apartment seemed to vanish. "You're terrible," Elena's voice came again, closer this time. And then a sound that Mark hadn't heard in years. A low, throaty laugh. Not the polite, social laugh she used at dinner parties with his architecture firm partners. This was a raw, unpolished sound. "Tell me you don't have to go back yet," the man, Julian, said. There was a long pause in the recording. Mark could hear the background hum of an HVAC system, distinct from their own apartment silence. "I don't want to," Elena said, her voice clear now, devastatingly sober. "God, I feel like I've been holding my breath for 10 years, and tonight I can finally breathe." Mark sat motionless. The sun continued to rise outside, bathing the room in a cruel, cheerful light. The voicemail kept playing, the seconds ticking away, recording the sound of his wife, dismantling his life, one whispered confession at a time.
Mark did not throw the phone. He did not scream. He sat with the unnatural stillness of a man watching a structural collapse in slow motion, unable to look away from the debris. The recording on the screen continued its relentless progress. 45, 46, 47. The audio quality was uneven, punctuated by the friction of the phone sliding against a nightstand surface. But the voices cut through the static with sickening clarity. It wasn't just the sounds of bodies moving, the soft, rhythmic rustle of high-thread count sheets that Mark recognized from their own bed. It was the conversation. That was the blade that twisted. "Does he suspect?" Julian asked. His voice was lazy, satisfied. It had the arrogance of youth, a tone that didn't care about consequences because it had never truly faced them. "Mark?" Elena's voice was a hum, vibrating against the speaker. "Mark suspects nothing. He lives in a world of blueprints and schedules. Unless I put it on his Outlook calendar, he wouldn't notice." Mark felt a cold flush rise from his collar, spreading across his face. He looked at the kitchen calendar on the wall, the neat grid where he wrote down their dinner reservations, her doctor appointments, his flight times. He had thought it was consideration. She called it blindness. "You're harsh," Julian chuckled, the sound wet and close. "I'm honest," Elena replied, and the shift in her tone was immediate. She sounded younger, unburdened. "With you, I don't have to be the curator. I don't have to be Mrs. Evans, the architect's wife who nods at the right time during client dinners. I can just be messy." "I like messy," Julian murmured. Mark closed his eyes. The image invoked was visceral. He thought of Elena at their last anniversary dinner, her posture perfect, her smile tight, checking her watch under the table. He had interpreted it as fatigue. Now he realized it was boredom. Suffocating, resentful boredom. She wasn't just sleeping with Julian, she was escaping Mark. The recording shifted again. There was the distinct clink of glass against glass. They were drinking. At 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning, while Mark had been asleep, dreaming of the renovation plans for their summer house, Elena had been sharing a bottle of something with a man 10 years her junior, dismantling the architecture of their marriage. "He's a good man, though," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sounded almost regretful. That hurt worse than the insults. Pity was a far more destructive weapon than hate. "He's safe, he's solid, but God, Julian, sleeping with him is like sleeping with a wall. There's no risk, there's no fire, it's just maintenance." Maintenance. Mark looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. He clenched them into fists until the knuckles turned white. He had spent 10 years building a fortress around her, ensuring she never had to worry about money, safety, or the future. He had treated our marriage like a heritage building, something to be preserved, protected, and reinforced. He didn't realize she wanted to burn it down just to feel the heat. The audio crackled loudly, a burst of static as the phone likely shifted position. "Come here," Julian commanded softly. "Wait," Elena giggled. It was a sound of pure, intoxicated delight. The rustling became violent, a chaotic scratching noise against the microphone. Then silence. Mark stared at the timer. 2041, 2042, 2043. The recording ended. The triangle icon turned back to a play button. The apartment was plunged back into silence, but the air felt different now. It was charged, toxic. The hum of the refrigerator sounded aggressive. The view of the lake, usually calming, felt vast and indifferent to his ruin. He sat there for a long time. The black screen reflected his own hollowed-out expression. He knew he should delete it. He should erase the evidence of his own humiliation. But his thumb moved of its own accord, hovering over the save button. He saved it. He transferred the file to his hidden cloud storage, the one he used for encrypted client contracts. He didn't know why, maybe because he was an architect, and he couldn't tear down a structure until he had surveyed every inch of the rot. A sound from the hallway made him flinch, the heavy thud of the elevator doors opening on their private floor. Mark stood up abruptly. His heart slammed against his ribs. He looked at the microwave clock, 9:15 a.m. She was home. He looked around the pristine kitchen. He had to look normal. He had to look like the man who knew nothing, the man who was safe and solid and boring. He placed his phone face down on the marble counter, took a breath that shuddered in his lungs, and picked up his cold cup of coffee just as the key turned in the lock. She was walking into the lion's den, but she thought it was just a Sunday morning. The door opened. "Mark?" Her voice drifted down the hallway, raspy and tired. In the kitchen, his voice sounded strange to his own ears, too calm, too flat, a perfect imitation of the man he used to be.
Elena entered the kitchen with the tentative grace of someone walking onto a stage without a script. She was still wearing the black silk dress from the night before, but the sharp elegance it had held yesterday was gone. The fabric was creased across the hips, and the hem looked tired. She was carrying her heels in one hand, padding across the heated floor in her stockings. Mark didn't turn around immediately. He kept his eyes on the steam rising from his coffee cup, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. "Hi," she said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual melodic confidence. Mark turned. He forced the muscles of his face into a mask of mild, husbandly concern. It was terrifying how easy it was to construct. "You're back. I was starting to get worried." Elena dropped her keys on the counter. The metal clatter sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She didn't look at him directly. Her gaze flickered to the coffee pot, then to the window, anywhere but his eyes. "I know, I'm so sorry," she sighed, rubbing her temples with fingers that looked pale and shaking. "It was a nightmare. The opening went fine, but around 1 I got hit with one of those ocular migraines. You know, the ones where the light just splits your head open?" Mark nodded slowly. He knew them well. She used to get them in graduate school. He remembered holding cold compresses to her forehead in the dark. He wondered if Julian knew about the migraines, or if he only knew the woman who wanted to breathe. "I couldn't even look at my phone screen to text you. I knew I couldn't manage the cab ride home without throwing up, so I just crashed at Sarah's place. She lives just a few blocks from the gallery." Sarah. Her assistant. The reliable, single friend. The perfect alibi. "Sarah's," Mark repeated, testing the weight of the word. "Yeah,
I slept on her couch. My back is killing me. She winced, stretching her neck. Mark watched the movement. He saw the faint, reddish abrasion on the side of her neck, just below the ear. It wasn't a bruise, just the friction burn of a beard or a rough collar. It was subtle enough to be missed by a stranger, but Mark was an architect. He noticed imperfections and surfaces. "I called you," Mark said softly. "Around 8. Elena froze for a fraction of a second, a glitch in the performance, before recovering. She reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. The screen was black. "Dead battery." She tapped it uselessly. "It died sometime last night. I didn't have a charger at Sarah's." It was a masterful lie. Simple. Unverifiable unless he pushed, which she knew he wouldn't. The safe Mark wouldn't demand to see Sarah's guest room. The solid Mark would offer her aspirin. "You look exhausted," he said, and for the first time he wasn't lying. She looked drained, but not from pain. She looked like someone who had spent the night expending every ounce of emotional energy she possessed. She finally looked at him, and he saw the glassy sheen in her eyes. I feel terrible, Mark, leaving you here alone on a Sunday." She took a step toward him, closing the distance. The scent hit him then. Underneath the stale sweetness of yesterday's perfume, there was the sharp, sterile smell of hotel soap. It wasn't the oatmeal and honey brand they used. It was generic, industrial floral. And underneath that, the faint, muskier scent of someone else. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his shoulder. It was a gesture of intimacy she usually offered when she wanted comfort. Mark stood rigid. His arms remained at his sides. He felt the heat of her body, the body he had heard moving against sheets just 6 hours ago. "I just need a shower and maybe some sleep. Can we just have a quiet day?" "Of course," Mark said, his voice flat. "Go shower. Wash it off." She pulled back, looking at him with a slight frown, sensing a jagged edge in his tone. But Mark smiled, a thin, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The day," he clarified. "Wash off the day." Elena studied him for a second longer, then offered a weak, grateful smile. "You're the best. I don't deserve you." No, Mark thought as he watched her turn and walk down the hallway toward the master bathroom. He waited until he heard the heavy wooden door click shut, followed by the sound of the shower turning on. Then he picked up her clutch from the counter. He opened it. Inside, next to her lipstick and a crumpled gallery program, was her phone. He pressed the side button. The screen lit up instantly. 84% battery. She hadn't even bothered to turn it off. She had just silenced it. It was a small detail, a careless error in her construction. But in his line of work, a single miscalculation was all it took for the whole building to be condemned. He placed the phone back in the bag, exactly as he found it, and listened to the sound of the water running, washing away the evidence he had already archived.
Monday morning in the architectural world was usually a sanctuary of order. It was a time for site reports, structural assessments, and the comforting predictability of physics. Gravity worked the same way on Monday as it did on Sunday. Steel beams held the same weight. But as Mark sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, watching a junior associate present a rendering for a new tech campus in Austin, the foundations of his own reality felt liquid. "The client wants transparency," the associate said, gesturing to a slide featuring a glass atrium. "They want this structure to feel weightless, like it's floating. But we need to reinforce the core, or the whole thing is just a pretty house of cards. Reinforce the core." Mark stared at the blueprint projected on the screen, but the white lines blurred into the memory of the audio waveform from the voicemail. "Sleeping with him is like sleeping with a wall," Elena had said. "There is no risk." He was the wall. He was the load-bearing column that held the ceiling up so she could dance in the atrium, and she hated him for it. "Mark, do you agree with the load distribution?" Mark blinked. 6 pairs of eyes were fixed on him.
He cleared his throat, adjusting his cufflinks, a gift from Alina 3 Christmases ago. Yes, but double the reinforcement on the south elevation. If the wind shear hits that glass, it'll shatter. He said the words automatically, his professional brain operating on autopilot, protecting him while his personal life disintegrated. An hour later, he was alone in his corner office. The door was shut. The blinds were drawn just enough to cut the glare from the midday sun. He wasn't working on the Austin project. On his dual monitors, usually reserved for CAD software, was a search engine bar. He typed the name, Julian Vane, Artist, Chicago. The results populated instantly. Julian wasn't obscure. He was up and coming. There were articles from local culture blogs, a feature in Chicago Magazine, and a sleek minimalist website. He clicked on the About page. A black and white photo filled the screen. Julian was everything Mark was not. He looked to be about 26 with messy, dark curls and a jawline that suggested he didn't eat enough. He was wearing a t-shirt covered in paint splatters, smoking a cigarette, looking at the camera with a brooding, pretentious intensity that Mark would have usually laughed at. But he wasn't laughing now. He was studying the enemy. He read the biography. Julian Vane explores the chaos of the modern psyche, rejecting the rigid lines of societal expectation in favor of raw, fluid emotion. Rejecting rigid lines. That was the allure. Mark dealt in straight lines, in grids, in codes. Julian dealt in the mess. Elena, who spent her days curating perfect exhibits and her nights in a perfect apartment, was starving for the mess. He clicked over to the gallery tab. The paintings were violent splashes of color. Deep reds, charcoal blacks, disjointed shapes that looked like bruised skin. They were chaotic. They were loud. They were exactly the kind of art Elena used to critique as immature when they first met. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for 10 years, she had told him. He scrolled down to the bottom of the page, where Julian's Instagram feed was embedded. He began to scroll through the timeline, acting as a forensic accountant of his own heartbreak. He saw a post from Saturday night. The timestamp was 9 p.m., hours before the voicemail. It was a photo of the gallery floor. In the foreground, Julian stood holding a glass of cheap wine, grinning. In the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, was Elena. She was talking to a donor, her head thrown back in laughter, her hand touching her necklace. He zoomed in. She looked radiant. She looked alive in a way she never did at his firm's holiday parties. He scrolled to the comments. "Great show, man. Energy was electric," one user wrote. "The Muse looks happy," another comment read. Mark's breath hitched. The Muse. He clicked on the user who wrote it, a fellow artist, someone in their circle. They knew. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a secret fling in a hotel room. It was an open secret in her world. People were watching them, commenting on them, likely pitying the husband who was at home checking the coffee stock. He felt a sudden, violent urge to sweep the monitors off the desk, to shatter the glass and let the noise match the chaos in his head. Instead, he carefully closed the browser tab. He picked up his fountain pen and aligned it perfectly parallel to his notebook. He had the name, he had the face, he knew the narrative. Now he just had to wait for the next scene to play out. He looked at his calendar. Wednesday night, the midweek mixer at the gallery. Usually he skipped these. They were for networking, for the artists to mingle with buyers. Elena never pressed him to go. He opened his email and typed a new message to his wife. Subject: Wednesday. "Elena, I cleared my schedule. I'd love to come support the gallery on Wednesday night. It's been too long since I saw the new collection." He hit send. He wasn't going to support the gallery. He was going to inspect the structure before he brought the demolition crew.
The gallery in Wicker Park was an industrial cavern of exposed brick and track lighting, designed to make the people inside look sharper and the art look more expensive. Mark adjusted his tie as he stepped through the glass doors, the humidity of the crowded room instantly clinging to his wool suit. He felt overdressed. He felt distinct. He was a straight line in a room full of scribbles. He spotted Elena almost immediately. She was standing near a pillar, holding a flute of champagne, laughing at something a donor was saying. She wore a backless dress he hadn't seen before, something daring, architectural in its own right, exposing the sharp curve of her spine. When her eyes landed on him, the laughter didn't stop, but it froze. For a microsecond, he saw the panic flare in her pupils, a glitch in the software of her performance, before she smoothed it over with a bright plastic smile. "Mark!" She glided over to him, placing a hand on his forearm. Her touch was light, performative. "I didn't think you'd actually make it. The traffic must have been terrible." "I made time. I wanted to see what has been keeping you so inspired lately." Elena's smile wavered slightly at the edges. "Well, it's a collective show, but... Oh, there's Julian." She pivoted and the air in the room seemed to shift, pulling toward a gravitational center Mark had only seen in pixels. Julian was walking toward them. He looked exactly like his photo, perhaps even more dangerously charismatic in 3 dimensions. He wore a velvet blazer over a t-shirt, his hair artfully disheveled. He moved with a loose-limbed confidence, the walk of a man who owned the room because he didn't care who paid the rent on it. "Julian," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming softer, richer. "This is my husband, Mark." Julian stopped in front of them. He looked Mark up and down, not with hostility, but with a detached curiosity, like he was examining a boring piece of sculpture. "The architect," he said, extending a hand. "Elena talks about you. The man of structure." Mark took the hand. It was warm, the grip firm but calloused, paint and turpentine. "And you're the man of chaos," Mark replied, keeping his voice level, matching the grip pressure exactly. "I looked up your work. It's very unrestrained." Julian smirked, pulling his hand back. "Structure is a cage, Mark. I prefer to see what happens when things fall apart." "That's usually when people get hurt," Mark said. The silence that followed was brief but sharp as a scalpel. Elena laughed nervously, a brittle sound that shattered the tension. "Okay, enough philosophy. Julian, the red canvas in the back is asking about something." "Let them wait," Julian said, his eyes still fixed on Mark. "I want to get Mark a drink. I want to know what it's like to live with a woman who breathes art, yet spend your days drawing grids." "It provides balance," Mark said, refusing to blink. "Someone has to make sure the roof doesn't cave in." For the next hour, Mark played the part of the supportive patron. He accepted the cheap white wine, he nodded at the right times. But he was watching them. He watched the way Julian leaned into Elena's personal space just an inch too close for a colleague. He watched the way Elena's body naturally oriented toward Julian, like a flower turning to the sun. But the most devastating moment didn't happen during a conversation. It happened in the silence. Mark had stepped back to take a call he didn't really have, positioning himself in the shadows near the coat check. Across the room, the crowd had thinned slightly. Elena was standing by the bar, looking tired. Julian walked past her. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. He simply let his hand graze the small of her back as he passed. A touch so fleeting, so familiar, and so possessive that it winded Mark more than a punch to the gut. It wasn't the touch of a lover trying to seduce. It was the touch of a partner. It was the kind of unconscious intimacy Mark and Elena used to have 5 years ago. Mark lowered his phone. The voicemail had told him they were sleeping together. The gallery told him they were in love. He watched Elena shiver slightly at the contact, her eyes closing for a second as she centered herself. She wasn't escaping Mark just for the thrill of the affair. She was escaping him because somewhere along the way she had decided that Julian was for real life, and Mark was just the obligation she came home to. Mark walked out of the gallery without saying goodbye. He stood on the sidewalk, the cold Chicago wind biting his face, inhaling the exhaust fumes of passing taxis. He took out his phone and opened the calendar app. Friday, anniversary dinner. He stared at the entry. He had planned to take her to their favorite Italian spot. Now he had a different plan. He wasn't going to cancel. He was going to let this structure stand for 2 more days, just to see if she had the courage to tear it down herself, or if she would keep lying right up until the moment the walls collapsed.
The apartment had always been quiet, a feature Mark had paid a premium for in the city. But lately, the silence had changed. It was no longer the peaceful hush of insulation in high-altitude living. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a submarine taking on water. It was Thursday evening. Mark was in the living room, ostensibly reading a monograph on brutalist architecture, but he hadn't turned a page in 40 minutes. He was listening to the sounds of Elena moving in the kitchen, the clink of a wine glass, the sharp intake of breath as she checked her phone, the frantic, rapid tapping of thumbs on a screen, followed by the slide of the device across the counter when she heard him shift in his chair. She came into the living room carrying 2 glasses of Pinot Noir. She looked frayed. Her movements were jerky, lacking their usual fluid grace. The encounter at the gallery had rattled her. She had sensed the change in the air, the way an animal senses a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. "Here," she said, setting the glass on the coaster beside him. "You've been staring at that book for an hour. Is everything okay?" Mark looked up. He didn't smile. He let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable, a technique he used in contract negotiations to make the other party nervous. "I'm fine," he said, his voice level. "Just thinking about renovations." Elena took a sip of her wine, her eyes darting to his face. "Renovations? For a client?" "For us," Mark said. He closed the book with a heavy thud. "I was looking around this place. It feels static, don't you think?" She frowned, confused. "I thought you loved this apartment. You designed the layout." "I did," Mark agreed. He picked up his wine but didn't drink. He swirled the red liquid, watching the vortex. "But maybe it's too rigid, too safe. I wouldn't want you to feel like you're living in a museum or a cage." She froze. The glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Structure is a cage. It was something Julian had said at the gallery. It was a sentiment she had echoed in the voicemail. "I don't feel like I'm in a cage, Mark. Where's this coming from?" Mark stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to her. The city lights were blurring in the fog. "I don't know. I just want to make sure you're happy, Elena. I'd hate to think you were just maintaining a life here, like it's a chore." Maintenance. Behind him, he heard the distinct sound of a glass being set down hard on the coffee table. "Mark, what is wrong with you tonight? You've been acting strange all week, distant, cryptic. If you have something to say, just say it." Mark turned around slowly. He looked at his wife, the woman who had lied about a migraine, who had washed another man's scent off her skin in their shower. He saw the fear in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of losing him. She was afraid of being caught. "I'm just tired, Elena," he lied, delivering the words with a cold, deadpan simplicity. "I feel like I've been holding my breath." The color drained from her face. It was instantaneous. Holding my breath. The exact words she had whispered to Julian in the hotel room. God, I feel like I've been holding my breath for 10 years. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She stared at him, searching for a sign that he knew, that he had heard the recording. But Mark's face was a perfect, unreadable mask. He gave her nothing. "I'm going to bed," Mark said, breaking the stare. "I have a long day tomorrow. The anniversary dinner is Friday, remember?" He walked past her without touching her. "Mark?" she whispered. He stopped in the hallway but didn't look back. "Yes?" Nothing. "Good night." Mark walked into the bedroom, leaving her standing alone in the living room. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a sick, hollow churning in his stomach. It was working. She was cracking. But as he lay down in the dark, staring at the ceiling, he realized that breaking her wasn't fixing him. It was just ensuring that when the end came, they would both be equally destroyed. He checked his phone one last time. He opened the file. He didn't play it. He just looked at the timestamp. 3:14 a.m. Tomorrow night, at dinner, he would finally hit play.
The reservation at Alinea had been canceled at noon. Mark had told Elena he wanted something intimate, something quiet. "Just us," he had said, and she had agreed with a relief that was palpable, even over the phone. She thought it meant safety,
She thought it meant the danger had passed. Now the apartment was dim, lit only by the architectural track lighting and the candles flickering on the dining table. They were halfway through a bottle of expensive Cabernet. The remains of a catered dinner lay on the plates between them. Soft jazz played from the invisible surround sound speakers built into the ceiling, a playlist Mark had curated years ago for nights exactly like this. Elena looked beautiful. She was wearing the pearl earrings he had given her for their 5th anniversary. She was smiling, her shoulders relaxed for the first time all week. The paranoia that had gripped her since Monday seemed to have evaporated with the wine. "This was a good idea," she said, swirling her glass. "The restaurant would have been too loud, too much performance. It's nice to just be here." "I agree," Mark said. He was sitting at the head of the table, his posture relaxed. He cut a small piece of steak with surgical precision. "I wanted to make sure we could hear each other. Really hear each other." Elena's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a reflex she couldn't control. But she recovered quickly. "To 10 years, she said, raising her glass. "To 10 years, Mark echoed. They drank. The wine tasted metallic to him, like copper. "I know I've been distracted lately," Elena said softly, setting the glass down. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. His skin was cool. "The gallery, the show, it takes so much out of me, but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm present." Mark looked at her hand. It was a beautiful hand. He remembered the way it looked in the photo on Julian's Instagram, holding a glass of cheap wine, unburdened by a wedding ring. "I know you are," Mark said. He pulled his hand away gently to reach for his phone, which sat face up on the table. "I actually prepared something. A song I thought fits the mood." Elena smiled, touched. "You made a playlist?" "Something like that." Mark unlocked his phone. He opened the media player. He didn't look at her. He looked at the connection status. Connected to living room. Audio. He pressed play. The jazz cut out instantly. For 2 seconds, there was only the hiss of digital silence, amplified by the thousands of dollars worth of audio equipment embedded in the walls. The room felt suddenly pressurized. Then the voice filled the room. It wasn't a singer. It was Elena. "Check the light?" Elena froze, her fork hovered halfway to her mouth. The blood drained from her face so fast it looked as if she had been struck physically. "Leave it off," Julian's voice boomed from the ceiling speakers. The bass in his voice rattled the silverware on the table. Elena dropped the fork. It hit the china plate with a violence that made them both flinch. She stared at the speaker in the corner of the room, then at Mark. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like a ghost watching her own haunting. "You're terrible," the recorded Elena laughed. The sound was crisp, high definition, surrounding them. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated pleasure, a laugh that had never echoed in this apartment. "Mark!" Elena whispered. It was a strangled sound. "Mark, stop!" Mark didn't stop it. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table, watching her. He watched the realization hit her, not just that he knew, but that he had known all week. Every conversation, every silence, every moment of kindness he had shown her since Sunday had been a lie. He had been studying her while she thought she was deceiving him. "Tell me you don't have to go back yet," Julian said. "I don't want to," the voice replied, filling the space between them. "God, I feel like I've been holding my breath for 10 years. Elena covered her face with her hands. She curled inward, her elbows hitting the table, shrinking under the weight of her own confession. She began to sob, a jagged, ugly sound that clashed with the smooth, intimate tone of the recording. "Sleeping with him is like sleeping with a wall," the recording continued, relentless, indifferent to her tears. "It's just maintenance." Mark listened to the word hanging in the air. Maintenance. He reached out and paused the track just as the rustling of sheets began.
The silence that rushed back into the room was louder than the recording. It was a ringing, deafening void. Elena lowered her hands. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes wide and terrified. She looked at him, searching for rage, for screaming, for anything familiar. But she found only the architect, cold, precise, and finished with the project. "I waited," Mark said. His voice was steady. "I waited all week for you to tell me. I gave you every chance. I canceled the dinner. I sat here. I waited." "Mark, please," she choked out, shaking her head. "I can explain. It was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake, Elena," Mark said, standing up. He picked up his wine glass and walked to the sink, pouring the expensive vintage down the drain. He placed the empty glass in the sink. "I'm going to stay at a hotel tonight. You can have the apartment. You like the view, don't you?" He walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sitting alone at the candlelit table, the smell of steak and ruin hanging heavy in the air. Mark returned to the apartment at 10 a.m. on Saturday. He hadn't slept at the hotel. He had simply laid on top of the stiff sheets, watching the ceiling fan rotate, counting the revolutions until the sun came up. When he unlocked the front door of the penthouse, the silence that greeted him was different from the silence of the previous week. It wasn't the heavy, secretive silence of a tomb. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a terminal. Elena was in the bedroom. 2 large suitcases were open on the bed, the ones they had taken to Paris last spring. She was folding clothes with a mechanical efficiency, her back to the door. She wore jeans and a sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. The glamour of the gallery opening, the seduction of the voicemail, the facade of the happy wife. It was all packed away. She heard her footsteps but didn't turn around. "I'm almost done," she said. Her voice was flat, scraped clean of emotion. "I'm only taking the essentials. I'll send movers for the rest next week." Mark leaned against the doorframe, his hands in his pockets. He felt surprisingly detached. He looked at the empty hangers in the walk-in closet, gaps in the row of clothes like missing teeth. "Where are you going?" he asked. It wasn't a question of care. It was a question of logistics. "Sarah's for a few days. Then, I don't know, maybe I'll find a studio. Something small." "Something messy?" Mark corrected softly. Elena paused. She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swollen, but dry. "I didn't want it to happen like this, Mark. I know you don't believe me, but I never wanted to hurt you. I was suffocating." "You weren't suffocating, Elena," Mark said, walking over to the window to look out at the gray expanse of Lake Michigan. "You were just bored, and instead of talking to me, you decided to audition for a tragedy." She zipped the first suitcase closed. The sound was harsh, like a rip in fabric. "I spoke to a lawyer this morning," she said. "Good," Mark replied, not turning from the window. "I called mine at 8 a.m. He'll be in touch regarding the separation of assets. The apartment is in my name, purchased before the marriage. You have 30 days to remove the rest of your things." "I know," she whispered. She hefted the suitcases off the bed. She struggled slightly with the weight, but Mark made no move to help her. That instinct, the husband's reflex to carry the load, had been severed the moment he heard her laugh on the recording. She wheeled the bags to the doorway, then stopped. She looked at the room one last time, the king-sized bed, the view, the life she had curated and then dismantled. She looked at Mark's back, stiff and unyielding against the morning light. "He's not who you think he is," Mark said suddenly. Elena frowned. "What?" "Julian," Mark said, turning to face her. "He talks about chaos and breaking structures, but guys like that, they need the structure to rebel against. Once you're free, once you're just another struggling curator in a studio apartment, he won't be his muse anymore. You'll just be real life, and real life is boring." Elena's face tightened. She gripped the handle of her suitcase until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to argue, to defend the passion she had sacrificed everything for, but the words died in her throat.
Because deep down, in the part of her that wasn't drunk on cheap wine and infatuation, she feared he was right. "Goodbye, Mark. Leave the keys on the counter," he replied. She walked out. He heard the wheels rolling over the hardwood floor of the hallway, then the heavy thud of the front door closing, then the click of the lock. Mark stood alone in the center of the apartment. He walked to the kitchen island where the keys sat, 2 silver pieces of metal on the cold marble. Beside them was the coffee maker, still cold. He took his phone out of his pocket. He navigated to the saved files. The file named 3:14 a.m. was at the top. He looked at it for a long moment. He had played it enough. He had memorized every frequency of her betrayal. He didn't need the recording anymore. The silence in the apartment was proof enough. He pressed delete. "Are you sure you want to permanently delete this item?" He tapped yes. Mark Evans put the phone down. He looked at the vast empty living room. The furniture was still there. The walls were still standing. The foundation was solid. The decoration was gone, but the structure remained. He walked over to the French press, filled it with water, and turned on the kettle. It was time to make fresh coffee.